Welcome to the Delingpole with me, James Delingpole. And before I introduce this week's incredibly exciting special guest that I'm really looking forward to talking to, I just wanted to say, do please remember, if you enjoy this podcast, and you jolly well will, because all my podcasts are bloody great, and this one's going to be no exception, please support me on Patreon. And I feel particularly supported here talking to a top businesswoman who I think will agree it's very important to monetize your product. Freedom isn't free, nor are podcasts. And if you want me to go on producing really good stuff, please support me. If you subscribe to my Patreon, you get to listen to my podcast at least 3 days early, and all sorts of exciting other perks as well, including my Not My Spectator column. Hard sell over. Here is this week's special guest, Helena Morrissey. Helena,
hello,
welcome
James.
To the podcast.
Thank you.
Because I don't know what it is about me, but I hardly ever have girls or women on my podcast, and I'm always being told off for saying things like using girls instead of women. And the last female podcast guest I had actually slapped me across the face, which I thought was jolly unfair. I think, maybe it's that women feel the need to kind of tell me off because I'm a bad boy. But I genuinely am excited to have you on the podcast. You always crop up in the newspapers as one of those sort of superwomen, don't you? You've got about 20 children, and you've got a high-powered career in the city.
Slight exaggeration. So I have 9 children and 2 grandchildren these days, actually. And yes, I've always worked in the city. And actually, I should say I don't mind being called girl. I wrote a book, A Good Time to Be a Girl. And there's my shameless plug. And quite a few people said they objected to the word girl in the title. And obviously, I didn't mean anything condescending or patronizing by it. I meant it in the context of girls are future women. And a lot of people are called girls, don't mind it at all, I think. So I don't object to that. So no metaphorical slap from me.
No, that's good. I think I had an inkling of this in my previous encounter. Well, I think I've met you once, and I follow you on Twitter. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so glad to have you on the show, because actually, if I were a girl of whatever age, I know I would be perfectly okay with being a girl, because that's the kind of person I am. And I almost think it's a litmus test of there are sort of women who divide, particularly in this world where gender or the sexes have been weaponized in service of a political cause, that women, I think, have been encouraged to take offense at stuff that really, really doesn't matter. There are so many more important issues in the world than whether or not somebody calls you a girl. And I think that actually people who are offended by that are very, very silly. So that you've already got brownie points from me. So well done. Thank you.
Phew.
Tell me about your fund that you manage in the city. I mean, it's worth, is it 49
so these days,
billion?
So these days, I'm no longer CEO of Newton Investment Management, which is where there were, we did look after £50 billion when I was there. At the moment, yeah. I stepped down from that a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and since then I've worked at Legal & General, where I was trying to encourage more people to invest, not just women. And I did launch a fund that was investing more in companies that did more around gender equality. But these days I'm a non-exec director. I'm at St. James Place, the wealth management firm, and I'm enjoying that. And I'm doing a few other things. I'm writing another book. I'm doing podcasts with my husband about importance of family life and the reset moment from lockdown. And yeah, doing what's called a portfolio of things.
So you are actually the dream guest to talk about issues arising out of the lockdown, which is you're equipped to tell me about the financial aspects of it and what it's going to do to our economy, but also what it's doing to things like children's education and stuff like that, which is just crazy, isn't it? And given your public profile, you could easily have been one of those people that kind of support the boring government line and sort of argue for the lockdown, but actually you haven't done that. You've been quite critical, I think, of the damage that's being done. Is it fair to call you a lockdown skeptic?
Yeah, I think, and I listened to your podcast with Dr. John Lees and agree with lots that he had said. I think that we all understand that at the start of it all, no one really knew how impactful the virus was going to be on life, and probably had quite a lot of sympathy with the government deciding that they couldn't take the risks. But I think, and as Dr. Lees said, we've had a lot of new evidence, and we've got to weigh up the impact on people who are vulnerable to the virus with people whose livelihoods and whose futures are being, really held to ransom really by what's going on. So I think at the moment, I definitely think the government needs to be much more transparent, I suppose, about the decision-making process. And at this stage, I've got a year 6 child. My youngest is 11, so she's gone back to school earlier this week. And it's kind of weird even for those children. They're put in these awful bubbles, they're called. And I think that's creating a real atmosphere of fear amongst children at a time in their lives when really they should not be fearful. And then, of course, we've got, I've got university age children whose job prospects are looking, pretty difficult at this stage. And then, of course, there's swathes of the economy, including people who are very, poor to start with, don't have a lot to start with, whose jobs are at risk, and it's going to be massive economic destruction, I'm afraid. So I'm somebody who sympathised with the idea of having maybe, a lockdown to start with. Now it's perhaps not shown to have saved lives, or not clear that it has, and the evidence is mounting that there are other risks to worry about. Then we should review it, and more quickly than is being done at present.
I'm totally with you. I think it's a perfectly reasonable position that one shouldn't judge the government on decisions made when there was much less information than there is now. Perhaps at the time it seemed like this was, this is particularly given there was a possibility, I think, which is now become increasingly likely, that this was a bioengineered virus to a degree. This is what Richard Dearlove, the head of MI6, has said, that it was engineered in a lab. So it's a bioweapon. So you can see why people like Boris and Gove might have panicked and thought, right, this could be Armageddon. But since then, we've had 10 weeks to discover loads and loads of stuff about this virus, and it clearly is not. It's no worse than bad seasonal flu, or even just seasonal flu. So I think we should be starting to get angry, shouldn't we, now? When you hear, for example, Dominic Cummings pushing for a quarantine. a 2-week quarantine for travellers and returning tourists. Does that make any sense to you?
It does not, and that's I think this point of transparency. I think if most people in this country are very interested in the reasons why things are being done, and I think perhaps there's been an embarrassment if government's got things wrong, or a sense that you can't admit mistakes. But actually, at this stage, I think people would be much more sympathetic to the idea and much more trusting if we're shown the information, have more discretion, have control to a larger degree over our own decisions. Clearly, the virus is very disastrous for certain people, older people, people with underlying underlying conditions and so forth. So I don't think it's fair to say it's just the same as seasonal flu, perhaps, but certainly for a lot of young people and a lot of people, we're not so young, James, you and I, but we're kind of fit and healthy, and we should be able to get on with our lives, really. And the quarantine at this stage, the idea of after all of this lockdown that people have gone through now, or in a week's time imposing some sort of quarantine after foreign travel, it just doesn't make any sense to anybody. And obviously it's the opposite of what most countries are doing, which is to open up, and we wanted to be global Britain. And I do suspect that the government, obviously a lot of ministers, including the Prime Minister, have had coronavirus, and I suspect he obviously had it very badly, and that might be influencing things. But I also do think they're struggling to sort of reel back from, just this idea that they may have overreacted to start with. But I think that's wrong. I think people would be just completely understanding and say, okay, you did what you did. to the best of your ability with the information you had then. Now we've got new information, so we need a new policy. Our businesses are run like that. I mean, if you stick your head in the sand and say, well, we've always done it this way, we gave you our strategy 2 years ago and we're going to stick to it, you would go out of business. You have to adapt to reality, to developments, and move on.
It's interesting you make that point, because one of my beefs as a kind of classical liberal, for want of a better phrase, is that time and again what we see is that the private sector is much more responsive than the public sector. The public sector is hidebound, sclerotic. Look at how companies look at the responses to this coronavirus crisis. Who's emerged really well? The supermarkets, for example. The supermarkets are not controlled by the government. This is the free market in action. They competed against each other. It was healthy. Whereas look at Public Health England, absolutely disastrous. You know, it tried to keep things like PPE equipment and the testing process away from the private sector, and look what happened. No PPE equipment, virtually no testing. I exaggerate, but it's been pretty disastrous for the public sector. And yet here we have a government which seems not to have learnt this lesson.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one exception to your correct account of things in terms of private sector kind of getting on with it often, and then the public sector lagging and having this sclerotic sort of processes and bureaucracy. Has been the army. I mean, I think the army has
totally
done extremely well through this and shown what can happen. I mean, obviously Nightingale Hospital is sort of empty, but was built in days, not years, and so it isn't foregone conclusion that things don't happen if they're in the public sector. But certainly, I mean, one of the lessons learned has to be much clearer line of sight between, the decisions taken and then the people implementing it, which you have to have in business, as I say, otherwise, you go out of business. Businesses aren't perfect, obviously, and, mistakes get made a lot of the time, but there is this accountability, because, you won't be able to employ people, you will lose your customers, and you will ultimately go under. So there is this skin in the game. It's an expression that's often used in fund management. You're a better fund manager if you have skin in the game, if your own money is put in the funds that you're managing. And I think there needs to be a bit more of that in some way in the public sector. And I would like to see in lots of areas a sort of more of a partnership between public and private sector, because I think private sector can really help. And hopefully that might be one of the things that emerges from this.
I'm always saying stuff about business and how it works and stuff, but I've never been in business, so I'm just it's just hearsay on my part. But you have actually experienced business, so you can tell me whether what I've been saying all along is true. That in the private sector, you are much more likely to get fired when you make a major cock up. Whereas in the public sector, you tend to be moved sideways or moved to a different department, but actually not demoted. Is that true?
Yeah, I think, if you are talking about a company sort of under contract and they make a huge error, then, you're going to get fired from it, or you're not going to get renewed. And, it's the marketplace. And then obviously as an individual as well, if you're no good at your job, you're not going to get paid to do it, and people are going to get rid of you. So it's harsh, and I have seen, the worst sort of cases where people get entirely greedy and profit's the only thing. And I do temper my enthusiasm for free markets with, you need to have some sense of community as well, which you might take issue with, James. I know some of your views, but I think, left to its own devices and run unchecked, you get real greed and you get short-termism that actually just enriches a few people and doesn't really help the country or the company. So that is a downside, but it is true that you've got this accountability point, and you will lose your job or your contract if you're no good.
To be fair, Helena, I have a fairly cynical view of the financial sector. I think that people are grotesquely overpaid for actually doing not much more than work long hours and shift money around rather than, say, widgets. I think that the financial sector has in the past and probably is still conducive to tremendous malpractice. For example, my father-in-law died recently, and like a lot of elderly couples a few years ago, he entered into this scheme whereby you give the ownership of your house to a company, and they give you a sort of a percentage of the house's value, and then when the house is sold, you discover that they own pretty much all the house, even though they've only given you a tiny amount a few years back. I haven't expressed it very well, but I was thinking, whichever person it was who devised this system to go around to old people thinking, oh, I can unlock part of my nest egg and enjoy a nice retirement, not realizing that they've been more or less raped by the financial sector. I mean, what's happened is disgusting. Or I think, for example, of collateralized debt obligations, sort of moving around toxic debt. These were products designed by people who thought about nothing but enriching themselves. They didn't think about the greater good. So I don't have a kind of sentimental atrocity. Nevertheless, I do think that, it's a vital sector of our economy. Am I being fair in what I've said?
I think you're being completely fair. I think, unfortunately, the financial industry is littered with countless examples where people have taken what might have been a good idea in theory. I mean, in theory, allowing people to have some of them equity in their house as cash to live on in their old age is a great idea, but it gets taken advantage of, and so people don't know when to stop. And shareholders have a responsibility there as well, because they often push companies to take more risks, to take more shortcuts, to be more profits oriented, less thinking about the customers and so forth. So I think you're completely fair on that, and it's not the only example. Obviously, we're just hearing again, the poor people who invested in Neil Woodford's funds, they're likely to get their last payment. Okay, I've touched a nerve there. So yeah.
Well, no, you have. No, keep
but
going.
That's right. Yeah, no.
Because Neil Woodford was the golden boy, wasn't he? Now it must have been, and he was always being touted as well. I mean, I once had a fund manager who sort of mentioned in a sort of quite flattering way the Neil Woodford fund. He said, obviously, past performance is no guarantee of blah blah blah. Nevertheless, it was clear that Neil Woodford was everyone's favourite fund. I remember the time, and it really wasn't so long ago, when Neil Woodford was he was like the surefire way of getting fantastic return on your investments. And I put a small amount in. I mean, I think I must have lost about $5,000 investing in, but it's still $5,000 that you could have invested in, I don't know, Tesla or something. I mean, how is it that people like Neil Woodford can get away with this and not be, because the financial sector is so heavily regulated? You would have thought that a SPID, which is what I think he pretty clearly can get away with this stuff. I mean, he's still sitting pretty while his investors have lost loads. How can that be legal?
Well, I completely get your outrage, James, and I think it's it's been such a sorry tale, and obviously he hasn't necessarily got away with it, because I'm sure there will be ongoing recriminations. But I think, unfortunately, the regulators are often one step behind. The people who are really clever, and Woodford obviously is really clever, but he sort of went around the rules. He didn't break the rules, but he created mechanisms to get around the rules. So that happens so often. I mean, if you look at the history of all of the disasters in the financial sector, it's always because there's been nice sort of rules there for the good people to abide by, but then the people who are really kind of one step ahead just think they're cleverer than the regulator, and they go, and it lasts for a certain amount of time, and then disaster strikes. And it's very sad. I think that one of the problems is that it's really been, and this is something that also applies, I think, with things like lockdown and so forth. It's really hard for people to admit mistakes and to say, actually, we haven't, regulated correctly here. This has all been a disaster. People tend to move very slowly to change systems and policies and ways of overseeing things, because nobody kind of ever wants to say, oh, we got it wrong. And yet, I think, we would avoid so much heartache and difficulty for people if we said, okay, fail, but fail quickly, admit it, fess up, we won't have a blame culture, we will then make things better. But we don't. We tend to move like a sort of tanker, really moving very slowly to change things. So I understand your anger. And I must admit, I was CEO of Newton at the time when Neil Woodford set up. And we lost money to his new fund. People were saying, oh, this is going to be the best thing ever. And it was because he was so-called star manager. We ran, and the company, as far as I'm aware, still has this team approach, but it's very unsexy. You know, it sounds very boring. Of this kind of team, more than one person. You know, it requires different brains to kind of come up with the ideas. It's not just all some god that can, you know, be master of the universe. And you know, that's unfortunate. That's you know, we are a bit susceptible to that as human beings. The glamour of the star, and when it comes to money, that can cost us very dearly, I'm afraid.
Yes. You see, I'm now really torn here because there's two different aspects of you that I find really, really interesting right now. One is the kind of the fellow lockdown skeptic who can rant with me about how bloody annoying the government's policy is. But the other one is your experience in the financial sector. And I really want to pick your brain a bit on that, because am I not right in thinking that the fund you managed was an income fund? So you were presumably helping people sort of retire and then live on the income. Is that
so?
Right?
Not really, no, because I was a bond fund manager. I was I looked after global bond and global bond and currencies, but I haven't run money for a long time, because then I became the CEO of the company, and then I became managing sort of a business that was looking after you know, people's savings. So to be honest, the closest I got to that was I would get a lot of letters from people personally addressed to me, because we had a big income fund at Newton, and it was one of the very popular ones. It was one worth, you know, billions. And I would get people actually come to the offices to ask me about the dividend payments on it, because they were living off the dividends. So to be honest, it was a really important thing that I would go down and meet them. I didn't invite them to come in. They just turned up, and people would say, oh no, don't go down, you know, we'll send somebody. And I said, no, they've taken the trouble. They might have come in from a long way into the city. And it was always hard to sort of sometimes reassure them or to give them what they wanted, but I could at least see how important it was. And so often the financial industry carries on as if it's nothing to do with real people's lives and real people's money and their livelihoods, their homes, their children's education. And, you know, it's something that I'm afraid has made me feel, I mean, I do a lot these days on trying to improve things in the financial industry. It sometimes feels a bit of a thankless task, I must admit. But, you know, it also does good for the country. There's a lot of tax receipts and so forth, but it would be so much better if it actually put people first. If it was much more the services, part of financial services, and less like it's us. And then I think this is one of the reasons, and I might get into trouble for saying this, but anyways, this is one of the reasons why the city was so anti-Brexit as well. I think a lot of people in the city were very pro-Brexit behind closed doors, but they didn't say that because it would have been a short-term, you know, pain on profit. So I was a bit lonely in the city. So I was, the only person really.
Isn't it?
Apart from a few hedge fund managers who are very wealthy and could afford to not have anyone talk to them. But anyway, I feel very sad. Yeah, and a few others. I mean, Howard Shaw. But these people are very, very wealthy, and they don't really need anybody else's approval or whatever. But I did, perhaps naively, try to create a debate and a discussion about the way, you know, what kind of world we live in and who we want to be, whether we want to be attached to the EU or whether we should, you know, go our own way. And I still firmly, I mean, everything that's happened since, I think, you know, the only way to be is pro-Brexit. But unfortunately, just we never had that discussion. And sadly, I know that a lot of people were more sympathetic to it, but just felt in the short term it would be very detrimental to the city.
Well, first of all, congrats on having been on the right side of the argument with Brexit and being on the right side of the argument this time, because there's actually not that many people who are like that. A lot of Brexiteers, for example, are now kind of what I call COVID bedwetters. They seem to, their authoritarian streak seems to lead them towards yearning for bigger government. But that's by the by. Isn't it kind of ironic? Isn't it ironic, as your favourite singer, I'm sure, Alanis Morissette would say?
Why would that be my favourite singer? She's very miserable. But anyway.
No.
I'm optimistic.
I'm sure she's not.
I'm full of contradictions. I'm sure.
You know. No. Isn't it ironic? Do you remember the predictions that were made during Project Fear. And
500,000
the city,
jobs, and now
500,000
500,000
jobs.
deaths, and now 500,000 deaths.
Well, there's that. Yes, there's that handy round number. But also, do you remember the sort of the predictions of the economic damage that was the hit to GDP that was going to be taken as a result of Brexit? Well, can you remember what it was? Was it about?
Well, there were
or
all sorts of numbers. I mean, some people said it was going to be up to 10. Some people said -2. You know, there was a lot of. But I did sit next to once one of the guys in the Treasury who had come up with was credited, so to speak, with the number that households were going to be worse off. Was it something like £4,063 and 22p or something? It was a very precise number. I probably got it completely wrong. And I said to him, well, how did you come up with that, precise number? And he said, well, actually, it wasn't a precise number. I said, it could be here, down, a low level. It could be here, a high level. And, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor added the two numbers together and divided them by 2. So, there's a lot of things that are said that are not really, we don't know answers. I did philosophy at university. Best to admit it when we don't know. When something is a guess, it's not that it's a bad thing if you have to make a best efforts guess. But we shouldn't have false science. We shouldn't have false precision. And we should think as we're going through. As I said earlier, it's the most important thing in life, and as far as I can see, and in business and in politics, is to keep thinking as you go through, as you learn.
Yeah. So, well, I agree with that. But the point I was moving on to was, okay, suppose they were saying the worst case scenario was that we were going to take a 10% hit to GDP. Well, only in our dreams now will we get a hit as little as 10% to GDP. I mean, what's it actually going to mean for the economy? Just spell it out for me. That we've been in lockdown far too long. We're not seeing signs that it's going to end anytime soon, even now. Can you spell out what the damage is? What's going to happen?
I mean, at the moment, I think that we are looking at Armageddon if we don't have major policy intervention. And obviously, they're doing what they can, and we can come on to whether that's the right things in a moment. But I think, obviously in the States, you've got 40 million Americans unemployed since this all started. And we've suppressed our unemployment figure with the furlough scheme, but we could get up to the 20% or so. We know that a quarter of people are on furlough at present. And so, I mean, that's just on average. Within that, we know that minority groups, women, young people are going to be much worse than that. We're obviously looking, predictions, have been as much as, 20 to 30% off GDP. And obviously within that, whole sectors, obviously hospitality and entertainment, airlines, if they have all the quarantine thing, car manufacturing. I mean, so many sectors. There's just very little light at the end of any tunnel at present. And I think it's one of those things where what you can't do is extrapolate the past. So the numbers have to be fast and loose at the moment. You just can't say, well, last time we were here, this is what happened, because we've never, ever knowingly ground the economy to a screeching halt and then kept it like that. And then, of course, we don't know, which is one thing I do think the Swedes thought about right at the beginning. They thought, how can we make this sustainable? Lockdown isn't something that we can do forever, even if at one end of the spectrum, people that we wouldn't agree with, but people say we can't sort of freely associate with each other until we've got a vaccine. I mean, who knows if we'll ever get a vaccine. So if we put that at one end of the spectrum, and then people say, well, just carry on about your business now, it's very hard to envisage how we lift lockdown in a way that is, ongoing, positive for the economy, that gradually encourages people. And that's partly because the fear of God has been put into people. People are very, very frightened about the disease. And that's I think one of the biggest challenges that we have as a country, that we've successfully engineered this fear, even if it was the wrong thing to do. And now people are too afraid. And you have to not be afraid if you're going to create, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, if you're going to live life to the full, consume, go out to restaurants, go to churches, So we've got a real problem about unlocking that fear factor now and turning that into hope.
Yeah. So, okay. So you're saying that it's not just the wretched government's fault, or rather it is for initially generating that panic, but now it's as much the public's fault for being so frit they won't go back to the schools, they won't go back to the restaurants and stuff. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling economic disaster.
At the moment, I mean, I do think my year 6 child that I mentioned, who's gone back to school and has to sit in this classroom with 12 little girls, and they have to sit a certain amount of distance apart, and they're not allowed to go out at break, and they can't see their friends and chat to their friends. I mean, it's not really a way you want your children to sort of live, really. But they quite interestingly at the school gates, and I've dropped off most days this week, the parents are just freely chatting and not sort of keeping their distance. And, these are all people who are, probably quite well educated, thoughtful about it. They seem to be just saying, well, if they're going back to school, we can chat, and so grateful to see each other. So I feel it won't take that much necessarily, but it does require a change in policy, and it requires, I think, a change in guidance. This 2 meters is completely unworkable. I tried to go to the post office the other day just to post a return. You can only order things on the online, obviously, and I mean it stretched so long. It just, people just were getting very cross and upset, and old age pensioners, and just is not a way to live. My parents are 80 and 81. And I know they've really suffered in lockdown. They would rather see their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and live a little than be cooped up, not allowed to go anywhere. And they'd like to take the risk, I think.
Totally. So suppose you've been made CEO of Britain. What would you be doing now? Okay, you are CEO, and tomorrow morning you take charge. What are your moves going to be?
So first of all, I would say we don't need a social distance. I mean, I think we might need to still look after the people who are vulnerable, but everybody else back to work. The most important thing is to feel confident that we've done the right things to contain the virus. It's safe now. It's fine now. And then, I think the government, needs to be quite radical about thinking about the economic policies. There's nothing they can do on interest rates. I mean, I'm definitely not a fan of negative interest rates. I think it completely distorts things and there's no sign that it works, no evidence that it works. So we haven't got interest rate policy. We need to get money in the real economy, not the stock market. That's why stock markets are better at the moment, because they're pumping lots of liquidity in, but that doesn't get to real people. We need to build things. We need to help with education and skills. We need to focus on broadband connectivity so you and I can see each other from our internet working. Yes. We need to make sure that young people, if they can't get jobs, are in an education, and they are using this time to really develop their digital skills. And we need to connect the country better east to west, not just north to south. So there's a lot of real infrastructure projects, not folly projects, but I think we just need to spend.
Not HS2.
Not HS2, I'm afraid, but we need to be bold about, okay, let's have a national insurance holiday. Let's make sure that at the moment people can keep the money that they earn, and let's encourage them to spend it and get the economy going through, what's called the velocity of money. If you have a pound and you don't spend it, it's not going to be as good for the economy as if you spend that pound and then somebody else spends that pound, and then we get the whole thing move. And you might not have to do it for very long. I mean, I'm not talking about, getting addicted to spend. I'm just saying for now, you've got to go out really confidently. I mean, the Queen sounds so confident about it. She doesn't have any more facts than you or I have, but she says, we will succeed. This will be a success. We will make, and we need a bit more of that from, so a bit more the Queen would be good.
Yes. You didn't mention that you're going to put the government's heads on spikes, although I hope that would be one of your
I'm a very nice, kind person.
Moves.
No, and I have a lot of,
soft spikes.
No, so I have a lot of sympathy with people getting things wrong, and I understand why things go wrong, but I want people to admit it, to come out and get our sympathy and our empathy around that, to be transparent about the policies. I just read this morning, actually, the minutes of SAGE, because I thought, okay, they're releasing the minutes now. Let's see what they're discussing. And they were discussing, the minutes that you can look at now were dated the 7th of May. So the minutes, the most recent minutes are the 7th of May. So we're kind of a month behind. And when one looks at it, again, there's no sort of sense of maybe we're wrong about things. Maybe we should get a few other inputs here. It's interesting that they are published, and I do think we should start, just for our own edification, to read them. They come out, each day, but they're this month's delay. but I just don't see the humility that's needed. And I think leadership in a crisis starts with acknowledging that you don't have all the answers, that you're confident that together you can make it through, but that we need everybody's ideas on the table, please, and not command and control, not this is what you've got to do because I know better.
So isn't another of your CEO moves then that you say, you issue a kind of a mea culpa, that you say, look, we got it wrong at the beginning because we didn't have all the information. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I think that would go a long way. I mean, there might be people who are very angry because they feel they've been locked up for no good reason, but at least then the same mistake won't be made again. And that's, again, what I think is interesting in different parts of the world where they are analysing and sharing, you know, in Norway or in some of the other countries have shared quite a lot of information about what they've been learning and say, well, even if we made mistakes, then at least it would mean we won't lock down again. And get that wrong again. We won't throw good money after bad, as they say in the city. And, you know, it's the only way, I think. I think the economy is really going to hit everybody, and the government will be struggling with that because if it doesn't come out now and switch gears, because as well, people will just think, they'll start to feel confident about, you know, the virus, the health crisis being passed, and then get the economic crisis. And, you know, there's only so much people can take, isn't there?
Isn't one of the problems, I'm going to pick your financial brain here, isn't one of the problems that the with the markets, you say that they've at the moment they've been kind of pump primed by all this kind of all the liquidity that's been put into the market by the Federal Reserve and so on. Which I think, by the way, am I right in thinking that this is a future inflation risk? I mean, once that money starts accelerating, we could have mega inflation.
It is. I mean, we had it already in the global financial crisis. This is the policy that they used, but obviously that didn't. QE
and stuff.
Yeah, that's the same sort of thing, but it didn't lead to inflation then. But yes, ultimately, it's inflationary. It should be.
But I'm thinking about all the people with pensions, and we mentioned people who are on they need a kind of fixed income ideally. And in the past, you had companies like Shell that paid out dividends reliably. Now we've got a lot of these blue chip companies which have suspended their dividend payments, sometimes for the first time in their history. How are pensions going to be able to pay out regular sums of money to pensioners in this time of financial craziness?
Well, I think it's going to be incredibly difficult because obviously one of the reasons why they're not paying out the dividend, it's not just so they keep the money, you know, for a rainy day, but a lot of these firms are also furloughing people and taking government money to do that. So, I mean, Tesco got into big trouble or at least criticised because it paid a big-ish dividend and then it had a similar amount of money come in from the government for furlough. So they have to be careful for that. But it just shows, we've tied ourselves in knot. The money has to come from, ultimately, we need job creation, we need entrepreneurship, and we need to get the economy moving again. Otherwise, there won't be any money to pay pensioners, for hospitals, for schools, for food. You know, it's just basic economics, really. You can keep going for so long just borrowing from the future, but you need to get that. You need to get people working, and we need to be optimistic. That the reality is it's really hard to be a successful person in business, I think, if you're a pessimist, because you always stop yourself from actually taking the risk and doing something that would be, ultimately going to create value, create something new. And so you look, and most people who run successful businesses tend to be optimistic. I mean, you don't have to be completely blithering idiot about it, but they tend to think that things might go right, not go wrong. So we need to, without optimism, without hope, it's going to be very difficult.
It's funny. My little brother is an entrepreneur, and he's exactly that. He doesn't like negativity. And I remember vividly last year, I said to him, "What would you do if there was a major economic collapse? Is your company geared towards surviving such an eventuality?" And he gave me a really sort of like dirty look, because I think you're right. Businessmen are optimistic, and they don't like to think about things like economic disasters. They have to bet on things going okay.
But
yeah.
sadly, obviously, that means at the moment, I think there's a particular double, disincentive for would-be entrepreneurs, because often a lot of people have gone bust, in the recent past, and so many people they've built up a business very slowly over 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and then it's all gone out the window, because obviously, again, we just shut the economy. I mean, schools have shut. I'm sure you saw yesterday that they closed the Minster School in York. I think it was founded in something like 620 or something, 627, and the income to some of these schools has just collapsed. So it's going to really change the culture of the country, and as well as the economy.
Yes, well, you mentioned earlier your children are going to have we've got children the same age, that it's going to be much tougher for them. I mean, do you think that, I reckon that this from now on it's going to be the East which is going to rise, and that the West is kind of, I'm still holding out hope for Donald. Where are you on Donald Trump, by the way?
Oh,
do you think he's our only hope, as I do?
So, no, I don't think he's our only hope. His language just appalls me all the time. I mean, my husband is a fan of his. The language I just hate the way as well it feels to me he's inciting violence. My husband keeps showing me that there's fake news and there's this, that, but it feels to me, my gut instinct is the man, is fueling the cultural wars that there are in America, which is not a good thing at present. But I think, so no, he's not the only hope. I do agree with Mike Pompeo.
You'd rather have Biden?
Well, no, I didn't say that. But I feel, rock's hard place. No, I mean, I've heard met Mike Pompeo a few times, the Foreign Secretary of State, and I think he's brilliant. One of the smartest men I've ever met, and I think he's very tough on China, and I think he's right on China. So where were we going with this? Why was Donald Trump suddenly a motif?
Okay. Well, I'm saying I think that the West is doomed. I think that for example, look at Boris's plans so far to get us out of the worst recession in 300 years, entirely self-inflicted. He's planning on green jobs, i.e. government taxpayer money going into putting up more wind turbines, which only survive through subsidies, which do not generate anything of value. So making energy more expensive. HS2, complete white elephant project, which is going to do nothing that we need. Huawei, getting into bed with the Chinese, enabling them to spy on us. I'm hearing nothing from this government which gives me any confidence that we're going to get out of this mega depression. I look at continental Europe, I see it collapsing. America, I'm slightly less worried about, but I think I look at the East and the Chinese are going to take massive advantage of this crisis. They're probably going to buy up cheap assets. They're going to continue their sort of world domination. I look at places like South Korea and Singapore, which have been very sensible, at least, and Vietnam even, which have responded much better to COVID-19 than we have. They've kept their economies open. So I'm thinking, do you think our children are going to have to move east to find their fortunes now?
Well, that was a lot in that question. I really think we've got to be on our guard against China, and that's something that I mentioned Mike Pompeo there. I think the Americans have got China completely right, and they are right to think of it as wanting world domination, as you're intimating. And I hope my children don't end up having to go east, because I think that would be it would be a bad result for the world if there is that if communism takes over everything. Yeah, well, also just because they want to bring they talk so tough. I mean, they absolutely have no desire or even attempt to negotiate on anything. It's just their way or the highway. I mean, look at what they've been saying about Hong Kong and so forth. And I just think we need to wise up to that and not do Huawei and stuff like that. I think it's just we're just sitting ducks if we do that. And I think we need to be very aware that there's a big threat there. I do think that there are some attempts. I just wanted to say something that. So it's not really out there in the public domain, but I know that behind the scenes, and I'm involved in some of this, there are big efforts being made to try and pull together an economic plan. that would be quite radical for post-COVID. So involving MPs, involving people in the laws, people in business, people, different small groups, often involving quite a lot of people who voted for Brexit, sort of some radical. So it's kind of people thinking, actually, this is really, we can't just kind of say, oh, well, let's just pick up where we left off. That is not an option here. Lots of the stuff that we never got around to when there wasn't a crisis. And I do think in crisis, it makes you think about the things that you want to do differently, that you now have to, because there's absolutely no choice. And so there is, I wouldn't be quite so doomy about it. Obviously, lots can happen between vague ideas and then is it going to be implemented? Are these ideas bold enough, etc. But I do think there's a lot of work, squirreling away behind the scenes and trying to get the best ideas out there on the table, and make sure that doesn't happen. That we're not succumbing to or surrendering to the East.
Well, but okay, it's really good to hear that. But do you share my view that we haven't really seen much from? Okay, so the MPs have all been locked away at home. But I haven't really seen much questioning of the quadrumvirate, of Boris and Raab and Gove and Rishi Sunak and their disastrous lockdown policy. I mean, why are we not hearing more opposition from MPs, and why are we not hearing much more vocal opposition from the business sector to this economic suicide?
Well, I scratched my head, same as you, James. I think I don't think any of us understand why there is this lack of proper debate about it. I heard Rishi Sunak just before lockdown. It was the week, just running into it, when he announced a series of measures that would be, he came up with we'll do whatever it takes to, keep the NHS bankrolled and so forth. And I must say, I think he's very impressive. And I think he probably, I would imagine, is trying to fight very hard for the economy within that group of four. And but clearly there needs to be, and this is probably partly because there haven't been proper sitting sessions, and it's all felt a little bit weirded out. I think it hasn't felt like we've got a proper House, and people even looking at the lines when they were doing the voting, that was just all seemed completely bizarre. We need somebody in charge and who's inviting more discussion, and let's thrash it out and let's get some answers. It needs to be more than just four people.
Well, yeah. By the way, I've been prompted by the course of our interviews, our chat rather, which is okay, so Trump, you're what I would call slightly unsound on, but then lots of people are. And obviously I don't go along with the whole women in business stuff. I just think I'm sure you're really good at your job, but I just don't believe in quotas or anything like that.
Neither do I. I don't believe in quotas, people. But yeah. No, we probably are a bit different from that. I've read enough of your pieces, James.
I think we know where I am.
Coming from different.
But still, given apart from the weaknesses I've mentioned, you are actually pretty sound. And what I want to know is, how on earth do you get away with this? Do you not get a tremendous amount of shit from? Because as we know, the corporate sector and the financial sector are now achingly politically correct. You've got companies like BlackRock talking about how we must divest of stranded assets of fossil fuels, and every company ought to be accountable for its carbon footprint, or all this nonsense. Corporate social responsibility, diversity, everything that I loathe is now kind of has permeated pretty much every nook and cranny of the city. How do you survive in that environment? Doesn't it drive you nuts?
Yeah, I mean, you point. So I thought you might find me a little bit hard to pigeonhole in the. I know your views about lefties and the people on the right and so forth. And I thought, okay, so I'm a bit of a conundrum for you, presumably, because I say I'm sound on a few things and very unsound on others. And I suppose I
didn't think very
quite unsound on others.
A bit.
So I suppose I would say I have I put my head down. I work really hard, and I performed, as it were, in the first couple of decades of my career. And I guess I then tried to use whatever power I had, which wasn't necessarily enormous, but I had, I was the chief executive of a major fund management company. I chaired at one point something called the Investment Association, which looks after, it's a trade body for all the fund managers, so about £7 trillion represented by that group. So I kind of tried to use that to change some things within. But you're right, it hasn't always gone down well. People like, the status quo if they're earning lots of money and if the system's working well for them. But I didn't think it was right for the longer term. And I'm afraid I'm just wired that way, that if something seems wrong, I kind of feel I need to try to change it, or to speak out, or to speak out anyway. Speak out. I couldn't have shut up about Brexit, for example. I mean, that was the biggest thing in 2013 when David Cameron had given his Bloomberg speech and said we were going to have a referendum. Yeah. I wrote an article for the Telegraph, which the Telegraph headlined, "Enough is enough, let's leave the EU." I didn't actually use that expression in my article, but I did say we need to take back control, effectively, in my own words, not as eloquently as the slogan eventually was. And of course, that kind of outed me on that issue. But I really thought, perhaps naively, that we would have a proper debate and that all ideas would be on the table, but it wasn't that way. So I have had a hard time, and but I'm afraid I just couldn't live with myself if I just sort of went along with the so-called consensus, because for an easy life, I'm just not wired that way, I'm afraid. Or maybe it's a good thing. I don't know.
No, well, look, I was you sort of semi-answered the question that I didn't ask, but you semi-did, because I was really asking you not so much about why you felt compelled to speak out about women, as more how on earth, given that you are pretty sound, how on earth you survive in an environment where every bugger, anyone who wants to get to a high level, has to virtue signal like mad. I mean, it's just endemic, and I don't see you as a virtue signaling person. I almost see your gender stuff as just kind of deep cover, basically.
It's not deep cover at all. No. So I would never want to. I mean, my husband uses that expression, virtue signal, a lot, and but I probably much more so than you. So this might be where you think I'm unsound now. I do see lots of injustices, and how people are treated, whether they have got wrong skin is the wrong color, or they haven't gone to the right school, or whatever. And I guess I've really felt that is a problem for the country, and for the economy, as well as for those people. We make the wrong decisions over and over because you've got a small group of people just deciding for everybody else, and they're not necessarily well qualified. I mean, you've been talking about the I can't say that word, like a triumvirate, only poor people.
Quadrumvirate. Yeah.
We do need diversity of thinking. Maybe you don't agree, but so my support for those.
Helena,
okay, you so don't. Okay, so you think everyone should just agree with each other, but they all have to agree with you, James? Yeah.
No, I tell you. Let me give you an example. Okay, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine is a CEO of a company, and one of his female employees was agitating to get on his board, and was sending him these kind of insinuating emails to the effect that kind of he needed diversity of opinions on his board, and that as a woman she was able to give the female perspective. And I just thought, bollocks to this. This is just very, very dodgy. Actually, the only thing that matters is talent. That's of course a decent CEO is going to be colorblind. Of course he's not going to care whether it's a man or a woman, but damn right he needs to find the best people for the job. And if they're all black women, well, that's absolutely fine. If they're all white men, that's fine too. I don't see a problem with it.
But let me give you a couple of examples then, James. So just go back to that SAGE, those minutes that I mentioned that were on the 7th of May.
Yeah.
They talked about the bubble idea, and they talked about it being a good thing for mental health because people aren't going to be on their own anymore, going to be in a bubble. And if you go down the points that they made about risks of the bubble, they were all about, what happens if someone breaks out of their bubble. You can imagine popping it, It's a silly expression. It's a very unfortunate expression. But anyway, there was nothing in it about actually, this might increase the sense of isolation. It might increase the sense of weirdness that we have about the world we live in at the moment. And there were, when you looked at it, it was just a purely so-called scientific view. It was like all about, the kind of facts around it. It wasn't anything about psychology or about how people really operate in life, and how we like to hug our mates and be friendly and just hang out with each other, and nothing about that. Now, if you had some other thinkers, not just the scientists, I mean, let's not move it away from men and women or anything like that. Let's say, okay, you've got a group of scientists and you've got a group of, people who did history or philosophy or whatever sitting around. They would say, well, hold on a minute.
Philosophy.
Oh, well,
not at Cambridge.
Yeah. Okay.
I wouldn't let any
All
of
right,
those in.
fair dibs. Okay, well, somebody else then. Somebody else. Then you might say, or history particularly, and you might say, well, actually, you know what? I don't think that's how people would like to behave. It's not. We're not all machines. We're not robots, And if you read the minutes, you think, when I got to the little end of the thing, I thought a whole section is missing here, and that's because nobody in the meeting, presumably, said, actually, I don't think we've thought it all through. We have it as if people are just little, machines that we can send off and give them instructions and they'll carry it out. And I think most people reading the minutes would say, well, that's not, how people work, but they didn't have anybody like us on the board or on the committee or whatever. So that's what I mean about diversity of thought. And I do think sometimes, people, I think men and women are often quite different. I know you refer to your children as girl and boy. So, you presumably have...
Just so they know.
Just so they know. But, I have a good sample size. I've, 9 children, 6 girls, 3 boys.
You do.
And the girls have always been, very emotionally kind of forthcoming, a bit more complex, boys straightforward, sporty, it sounds stereotypical, but I actually think it kind of takes all sorts to make a world, and it's great that people have got different ways of operating, but you wouldn't want to have all girls or all boys at something. You would want to have just shake it up and have some different ideas, and that the 4 people.
Yeah.
There's no women obviously on that. I don't think you should have a woman for its own sake, obviously, but you should be thinking, because when I looked at the list of age groups that were going to go back to school first, I thought, well, I want to know the rationale for that. Why are they sending, reception back when, it's presumably going to be quite hard to social distance 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. Anyways, I think it's more than just about, it's not really about gender. It's about, bringing different ideas.
I can say you've made a very reasonable case there, and I agree with you at least.
I think that's a win. I think that's a win, James.
You've won it. No, because you've used what you've done.
By your standards.
You've used your. You've used your feminine charm and your gentleness, whereas a man would have just said you're wrong, and you don't know what you're a sexist pig. He'd have said. Or something like that. So that's good. Yeah,
so I'll give you one last thing. I know you want to move on from this subject, I'm sure. But so the 30% Club, which is set up, which is trying to get more women on boards, but not for its own sake, because we just had a financial crisis. And the average person on the board was, 65 and been to the same school and, just all hung out together and had no other views apart from the little group. Anyway, it's not a quota. It was voluntary. But persuaded the chairman to support it because these were their boards. Again, not by telling them what to do, not by saying you're wrong to have all these men, but actually by asking them, what the benefits they had seen were, and them talking to each other. And some of them were very skeptical. They did not virtue signal at all back in 2010. They said, I can't see the point. And then, there was this one guy who gave me this story about, he was the chair of a real estate company, and they were going to do a joint venture in China, topical subject now. And he said there was one woman on their board, and they just had their quill pens to the ready, and they were all very sort of puffed up with pride, and they're going to sign this deal. And she kind of tentatively put up her hand and said, I think you've forgotten about one of the risks here. We haven't structured it properly. And they were all really annoyed with her, he said, because they didn't want to have, stop the deal. But he said, she was right. And the reason I realized that the others hadn't, we'd all been so excited about the deal and so sort of, macho about it. We hadn't even wanted to spot there was a problem. And he said, we did end up doing the deal, but we changed the terms. It was a much better deal. And I know that she spotted it because she was outside the group. She didn't feel the pressure to conform. She just kind of said it because it was on her mind. So that was much more powerful than me saying, you've got to have a woman on the board because, you know, women are great. He saw it with his own eyes.
Yeah. But they could. It wouldn't necessarily have had to be a woman. It could have been a pop. I was reminded of that, what you were saying there, of General Swarovski planning for Operation Market Garden, and they outlined all this brilliant scheme they had to, you know, we're going to land these paratroops here and there, and the Americans are going to move on this road. And General Sosabowski said, "Gentlemen, you're forgetting one thing." And he said, they said, "What's that?" And he said, "The Germans." And they hadn't planned for the German, or rather, so he thought, they hadn't really planned for the German fantastic counter-attack capabilities and so on. And of course, Sosabowski was right. Yeah, no, I clearly there are going to be cases where having a woman on board is a desirable thing. But you know, the counter argument to your position, which is that what it does, it inevitably leads to quota systems, and what you find is a sort of limited talent pool of women being headhunted from all kinds of directions, and actually some companies having women on the boards who really are only there for tokenism rather than anything else, and that's not a good thing, I would say.
Well, I mean, we're going to have to beg to differ on this, because I think when you look at, I mean, we've gone now to beyond 30% women on FTSE company boards and the next 250 companies. But actually, you're talking about a few hundred women joining these boards. You're not talking about hundreds of thousands. And if you're saying there are not a few hundred well-qualified women in this country who can sit on, or globally, because these are global companies often, I mean, I beg to disagree. I'm not saying any old woman goes on this board. And I'm saying look a bit wider than just, you know, your friends from the golf club or whatever. And yeah, time will tell. It's hard. You can't really have a control, you know, group and say you companies can't hire any women and you hire lots and see who does better. You can't do it like that. But women are, you know, your daughter, I don't know how old she is, but, you know, I'm sure you're educating her really well, just like your son.
Oh my God, she'd eat me, and she cannot listen to this podcast. She would absolutely kill me. I mean, you know, some of the questions.
Or read any of your articles. Or read any of your articles. Or
yeah, absolutely. I would not dare. Yeah. Look, I think we can agree on we can find a point of agreement here, which is, I would be happy if the women on every board, if they were like you and Ruth Lee. Do we love Ruth Lee? Isn't she one of the best things in the world?
Yes, we love Ruth Lee. Okay, it's a deal. In fact, you're going to laugh, because I was just clearing out, and I came across, I just happened to have this by my desk. You probably can't read it. It says Change or Go. So this was the Business for Britain's little booklet. I mean, it's the tiny version, which had, Ruth was, I think, pretty much involved in some of these charts, because she and I used to share a platform from time to time, and she'd whip it out too. So there you go. Yes, Ruth's good.
You see, Ruth is another person actually who doesn't make a big deal about the fact that she's female. You know, she's just Ruth, and she does good things. Yeah, good. Well, we've cleared that one up. Any other business arising? So, are you any good on tips on market tips and stuff? I mean, do you follow the markets as an investor?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not regulated to give financial advice, says she, so occasionally. Just kind of, you know, I have to. I personally, at the moment, think markets have got a bit carried away with all of the, you know, they've diverged. Wall Street diverged from Main Street, as they say, and keeps hitting record highs, but going back to, you know, 7 months ago sort of positions and so forth. So I'm a bit wary of stock markets at this level, I got to admit.
You and Warren Buffett both.
Well,
he's
good
in
company
cash
there.
at the moment, I think.
He's in cash, yeah. Well, I'm not in the same league on a you know, amount of money that I have as Warren Buffett. I hasten to add, I'm not going to move markets like he does. But
no. But do you? What I'm asking is, do you manage your own funds, or do you just put it in an investment? Do you have it managed for you?
So no, I look after my own. I mean, I just I do sort of quite diversify a bit. I mean, I kind of and I use funds. I don't invest in individual stocks because that would be kind of difficult with work that you have in the city. It's very hard to prove that you didn't have any, information or something. So I do invest in funds.
Oh.
But,
right, which is not so exciting though.
It's not quite as exciting. Sorry, yeah, it's not like horse racing tips that I can give you a kind of bet on this one. But yeah, I'm quite encouraged. My 14-year-old son is very keen on investing, and he's just been doing a model portfolio just to show me his interest. But he's the first one of my children who's shown any flicker of any interest whatsoever. So yeah, he's very keen on finding stocks that excite him. So you never know.
That is actually every parent's dream. We're the same. Whenever we hear a sign that our children are showing a glimmer of interest in markets, we think, yes, finally they might get it. But 1 out of 9, yeah, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, and he's the 7th. I had to go through a lot before.
Well, but because because of your business success, do you kind of look at those? I imagine some of your children are kind of drifting towards more arty-farty, I just want to be happy type things. And how does that make you feel? Do you fear for them?
No, I mean, obviously, I want them to be happy. They are, as my husband says, they're very. He goes creative,
Yeah,
so
creative, yeah.
I mean, who knows? I suspect it's. I mean, 9. You're going to have quite a lot of different interests in that. So there are ones that are kind of quite feisty and entrepreneurial, and you think, okay, business people, they're going to set up something, and then others who are more they read a lot and write poetry, that kind of thing. But we'll see. I've got one who's an academic actually, so he's 28, my eldest son, and
he's doomed then, isn't he?
Well, I don't know. He's a Middle East specialist, so that's might not be quite as doomed, as there's always going to be somebody interested in what's going on there. So yes, he's fluent in Arabic, and he's at Oxford University. But anyway, yeah, so who knows? Can't worry too much if you have 9.
That is one of the upsides of having 9 children, isn't it? I mean, you don't get sucked into their emotional struggles too much because there's not enough space, is there?
Well, it doesn't work quite like that, but yeah, there are certain things we can't live our children's lives for us, is one of my husband and I mantras, and it's partly because of practicalities. But
and is there a wide range of political views within your family, within your self-contained enormous family?
No, they are all
really?
quite conservative. Yes, or else they have
well done, Mark. Or is that Dad?
I think it's a mix of the two. But yeah, Richard, my husband, used to send Spectator articles and so forth to children when they were like 8 or 9, prep school, and we've always discussed political things, and so we may have there was a very strong Brexit vote from our household. All those who could vote did so.
This is my final thing, because I think we've delighted our audience enough. But we both sent our boys to Eton, and I used to think that you sent your kids to a school like Eton to have them taught to be incredibly sound and believe all the things that we do. But actually, a lot of Etonians are incredibly unsound, and Eton these days seems to be as kind of politically correct as a lot of state schools. Have you noticed that?
So I'm a governor at Eton, so I should declare that interest at this point.
Oh my God!
So I am one of the.
Can I just say to you,
I will
really
take this on board.
About what's happening to that school.
Oh well, you'll have to divulge, because I'm very happy with it. Okay, come on then.
I think it's really gone wrong. I'm very disappointed by Eton.
Give me an example. Give me an example.
I hated that touchy-feely bleeding heart letter that the head man put out recently about how he wanted to bring more poor kids into the school. I mean, Eton was already doing a very, very good job of helping boys on bursaries and stuff. But there comes a point I sense that this is a headmaster who would very happily ditch that penguin suit uniform in a trice if he possibly could. I gather the resistance comes from the boys who are more conservative than some of the administrative staff. But I really sense that school is embarrassed about being Eton and wants to go down the St Paul's Girls' School for Girls route, which is to let's pretend we're not a private school. Let's pretend we're a state school with all the kind of politically correct values that go with that. That's my fear.
Okay, well, we're going to differ on this one as well, James, because I'm a big fan of Simon Henderson, the headmaster. I don't think he's bleeding heart liberal. I think he actually does want to. He always talks about harnessing Eton's excellence and trying to encourage, state schools to go sort of up and more pupils to have access to it. And, one of the things they've done, just as an example, which I think takes nothing away from Eton, but actually adds to the whole nation, is that on the day that lockdown was introduced, they said that they were going to make the Eton X courses, which are digital education courses, available for free to all state school pupils in the country. And I think something like 180,000 access codes have been granted. So there are 180,000 students who either have taken the courses or can take the courses so far. And it costs Eton nothing. Basically, they've got the courses already. It's kind of gift. And I just think that's a great thing to do, and I don't see that that's incompatible with being proud about Eton. I think he stands up for Eton's heritage as well, but he wants to modernise it and make sure that it stays relevant and is well regarded.
Relevant. You used the R word.
Relevant. I used it. It's gone for an hour and how many minutes?
Oh my God, Helen! This is like what the RSC does.
Uniform. No, he doesn't want to ditch the uniform, and
yeah.
I think it's.
He does want to, but he's not able to.
No. Well, I've never heard him say he wants to ditch it. He wears it with pride, and my youngest son is still there and enjoys it. And I don't think. I've spoken at societies there. I don't think it's become. The views espoused are not dissimilar in some senses to your own, James, but they are welcoming of lots of different views as well. So I just think it's necessary. If you're going to stick around, I think Eton has to be, showing that it's contributing and not just for those boys who can afford to go. So we're going to have to disagree on this one too. So I was sound, unsound.
No, you're sound. I just think, look, I think it's like, you have to wear the cloak. You have to wear, you couldn't be, basically, Helena, you could never have got as far as you have if you were as completely outspoken and sound as a pound as I am. I mean, you'd never get away with it. Nobody is as sound as me and gets on in the city or anywhere else. It's just like the only hope for people like me is doing podcasts and stuff. That's it. Or private income, which I haven't.
And it helps with the you add a lot to the to the rich tapestry of our lives, James. I think it's the gaiety of the nation. I think it's really, I have to say, I think as a final point, I mean, I think I have sometimes had to be quite courageous and speak out when the overwhelming majority of people would just rather I just kept my head down and went along with everything. So I don't think I've always worn the cloak, but I have tried to stick true to what I actually believe in. And it may be that there are different, I have, what seem like an incompatible set of views with each other, but I suppose I make my mind up on every issue rather than saying, oh, well, I'm right of centre, so therefore I need to be on this side on every issue. And I believe firmly in localism and community and family. We haven't talked at all about family really. And I think the lockdown has been a great thing for lots of families. It's been, we probably shouldn't say good things about lockdown in terms of like a lot of people have suffered, but actually has been a lovely reset moment for lots of families. We've been 13 in our household for most of the lockdown, including my grandchildren, and it's been amazing time to spend time with each other, just playing silly games, that we never did before. So, we have to. Make no apology.
I'm going to whisper this bit because it's off brand, but I've secretly quite liked being with my family too.
There. Wow, what a revelation. Well, your family might listen to your podcast now.
Don't. Don't tell anybody, okay?
Out of the
Just
bag.
between us. No,
I
shush.
think
It's going to kill my career now.
Listening to the recording after and checking you get that bit in, James.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, thank you, Helena. I don't think you're not a terrible cuck, actually. I think you are pretty sound still. And thanks for being on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Bye now.
Right. Bye.